Bob Murphy Show, episode 332.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews, conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be speaking with Phil Mauriello Jr., who, among other hats that he wears, is the co-host of the podcast California Underground, which gives a platform for conservative and libertarians out there. And he's also a practicing attorney. And what he's speaking, he was recommended to me by some people on Twitter. And so he's speaking on the recent Supreme Court Chevron ruling. And so in case you wanted someone to just dive into the weeds and explain what the heck was this thing and what's the big deal, that's what we're doing in this episode. So here's my conversation with Phil Mauriello. Phil, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Thanks for having me, Bob. Glad to be on.
So I had gone out to the crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, I guess, and asked the folks on Twitter, hey, I want someone to come on and talk about the Chevron decision, and you were recommended. And so I think, and this isn't false humility. I really don't know that much about what the original status quo had been, even though I've done a lot of work on like energy regulation and stuff. So can you just, with as much detail as you think people need to know, what was the situation, a month ago? And then so that we can understand the import of this recent ruling?
Yeah, I think I'll try to not bore your listeners with the exciting details of EPA regulations and how they kind of evolved from the 1950s and the 1960s until the 80s when this first case was heard.
Okay, I do talk about Federal Reserve open market operations, so you might not bore them. But it's
well, in that case, they might get a thrill out of this.
Yeah.
I got my notes right here because it's if you were reading this for bedtime reading, it'd probably work really well because it's not the most exciting case in the world. But basically, it was a case decided in 1984, and what I'm talking about is this Chevron case, the Chevron Deference case.
Right.
And this has been like part of our jurisprudence in federal jurisdiction for close to 40 years at this point. So basically, what had happened in 1984, this was the Warren Burger Court. Ronald Reagan had just came in. They changed some of the EPA regulations. And there was a whole argument over what is a stationary source and what the bubble concept was. These were things that the EPA put into their regulations based off of the Clean Air Act that was put into place many years before. So there was this whole fight over like, well, what is stationary source? Congress didn't really define what that is. There's some ambiguity as to what that means. What's the bubble
a source
effect?
of emissions that had to be regulated for air quality?
Right.
Is that the... Okay.
Yeah. So that's what stationary source was. What they were referring to was something like a building or a chimney or something like that. Those were the things that would put off emissions that they would have to get within the parameters of what the EPA wanted them under the Clean Air Act. And so there was a little ambiguity over that. They had sued, Chevron had sued and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And again, without really boring you over the details, Justice Stevens was the one who gave the opinion on this case. Let me see if I can find my notes. He had said that under this definition, an existing plant that contains several pollution-emitting devices may install or modify one piece of equipment without meeting the permit conditions if the alteration will not increase the total emissions from the plant. And that's regarding that stationary source. And there was something in the code that said stationary source means any building, structure, facility, or installation which emits or may emit any air pollutants subject to regulation under the Act. The court observed that the relevant part of the amended Clean Air Act does not explicitly define what Congress envisioned as a stationary source to which the permit program should apply, and further stated the precise issue was not squarely addressed in legislative history. I had highlighted that because I think that's really interesting that in this case, when courts are deciding like how to determine the ambiguity or look through the ambiguity and determine, well, what was the meaning? What was Congress's intent? So the legislative body comes up with these laws and they look at what was the legislative intent. Legislative history is usually a good indicator of how things are written. There's notes, there's proceedings, there's committees, people talk about it. So you get sort of a feeling of, well, what were they going for here? Like, let's read between the lines. Let's take a peek behind the curtain. And in this case, there was no legislative history. So there was no legislative history, and there was nothing that Congress even said about this specifically, which if you are someone who is not a fan of the administrative state, this is something that I think is terrifying that the Supreme Court back then said, yeah, that's fine, that Congress basically didn't explicitly define what you need to do. There's no legislative history to show that Congress even contemplated a definition of what you need to do. So we'll just let the administrative agency figure it out.
Can I ask you, Phil, and if you don't know, it's fine, but do you know this, like was Chevron arguing that, oh, these things here are not stationary? And the EPA was saying, well, of course those are obviously stationary. And that was a dispute. Like, do you know what the particular was?
The argument, as I understood it, was they were coming up with this plant-wide definition for one thing. So they wanted, like, you have a plant and you have all these stationary sources. They were saying, well, can we get, like, a definition for the entire plant rather than just, like, this one chimney or this one building?
Okay.
Like,
yeah,
can we get, like, a plant-wide definition? And basically they were sued and they said, well, no, you can't just implement a plant-wide definition.
Okay, and that's why that excerpt you just read a minute ago, that makes more sense to me now with this context, that if they're rearranging and they're doing stuff to one chimney and something over, as long as the total emissions from the plant don't go up, the company wants to say, come on, that's not hurting the environment anymore, so we should have the freedom to do that. Whereas if it was applicable to each individual source of emissions, then maybe what they were doing wouldn't have been allowed.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where the ambiguity of, like, well, and again, the legislative history of the Clean Air Act, which is kind of laughable at this point, anybody who follows the EPA, was their goal was to balance between helping the environment and slowing pollution and also not stifling economic activity, which anybody who knows the EPA right now knows that's probably not their goal anymore. But that was their balance back then. So they were trying to balance these factors of, well, we don't want to be too harsh on businesses because we don't want them to just pick up and leave or stop doing what they're doing, but we also want to stop pollution. I mean, this is also, 40 years ago. The EPA has completely changed in 40 years.
And as you said, I mean, this was Reagan administration people.
Right. And the ironic thing is, when this ruling came out back in 1984, this was actually hailed by conservatives at the time as a huge win for them, because they believed that they were implementing the Reagan rules or the Reagan policies. So they thought, oh, this is a huge win for us because this is what we want. Mm-hmm. And at the time, no one actually thought this was going to be that big of a deal. They thought this is one of those quirky little one-off cases that, is really niche. Not really many people are going to know about it. Mm-hmm. They didn't expect, like, Chevron to become like this behemoth in federal jurisdiction and what it did for the administrative state. So there's some other notes that I want to go over, and then we can kind of move into, like, the future. I just want to give everybody sort of a basis of, like, where we came from, like, what is Chevron deference and where it came from. This was the standard for when they were trying to review any sort of agency construction of a statute. It says, when a court reviews an agency's construction of the statute which it administers, it is confronted with two questions. First, always, is the question whether Congress has directly spoken to the precise question at issue. If the intent of Congress is clear, That is the end of the matter for the court, as well as the agency must give effect to the unambiguously expressed intent of Congress. If, however, the court determines Congress has not directly addressed the precise question at issue, the court does not simply impose its own construction of the statute, as would be necessary in the absence of an administrative interpretation. Rather, if the statute is silent or ambiguous with respect to the issue, the question for the court is whether the agency's answer is based on a permissible construction of the statute. So there we can start to see sort of the beginnings of what becomes Chevron deference.
Can I ask you, the thing you just read, was that in the opinion for Chevron too, or was that a subsequent thing?
No, this is all directly from the opinion in Chevron.
Okay.
So I'm a big fan of when I have these big readings. I like to write it down or highlight it.
Okay.
So that was sort of the beginning of Chevron deference. They go on to say, if Congress has explicitly left a gap for the agency to fill, there is an express delegation of authority to the agency to elucidate a specific provision of the statute by regulation. Such legislative regulations are given controlling weight unless they are arbitrary, capricious, or manifestly contrary to the statute. So again, this is where we're starting to see this kind of the beginnings of this monster in federal jurisdiction, which becomes Chevron deference, which is, well, if Congress isn't really completely specific about what they're going to say, we're just going to defer to the administrative agency. It's not really up to us as the courts to figure that out. And
it's sort of like a perverse 10th Amendment in Bizarro world thing where, any power is not explicitly reserved by Congress to itself, the court will recognize that the executive branch holds in the agencies. That
exactly. It's almost like the 10th Amendment for the fourth branch of government, which is the administrative state. It becomes, and that becomes the beginning of how many people begin to cite to this Chevron deference rule. Fun fact: the Chevron deference rule had been cited 18,000 times in published cases, so it has a lot of legs. To give you an idea, in 40 years, 18,000 times is a lot of citations to the Chevron deference, and that's a lot of cases that have used it to argue why they should have more power. There's one more thing I wanted to find because I believe this is probably the most.
Can I stop you, Phil? So I think let me just make sure we're not losing anybody. From what you just read there, let me paraphrase it and just tell me if you think I got the spirit of it. So that excerpt you read, they were saying clearly, if there's a dispute, if in the original legislation authorizing this agency or whatever the particular act is or whatever it is, clearly if Congress had a clear intent on that particular matter that's under dispute, then that's what happens. If the court feels that it knows what Congress's intent was, then that's what it's going to do. And if the agency's violating that, then the court's going to stop them from doing that. You got to do what Congress's intent was. But if it's clearly within the jurisdiction of what this agency is, operating on, but the specific issue under dispute, the original authorizing legislation was kind of silent on that, so we have no idea, then they're saying it's not the court's role for us to be coming up with our own, why don't you try doing it this way? No, as long as what the agency is doing makes sense, as long as they can give a plausible justification for what they're doing, then go ahead and do that. It's not that the court tries to come up with a better justification. So, and maybe you were going with this, but I guess that leaves the open question. What would it mean to be impermissible? Because, they said as long as the agency's doing something that's permissible, what would be impermissible? Did they give any guidance as to this is the kind of thing we mean? Not that they are cutting off goat heads and spreading entrails around and coming up with rulings that way.
Well, I think that's what made Chevron deference so scary for anybody who kind of opposes the growth of the administrative state. As you lined out, there is this sort of three-step rule of, well, let's look at the statute. Did Congress have intent? That's obvious. Okay, we look at it. It's written into the law. That's Congress's intent. Boom, case over. If not, we go to rule 2, which is, can we look at Congress's legislative history to get more intent? If not, okay, great. Then we go down to rule 3, which is we defer to the administrative agencies, and they can fill in the gap as long as it's reasonable. Now, what may be reasonable to me could be completely unreasonable to you. And reasonable is such a subjective term, especially in law. Reasonable is such a subjective term as to, well, what's reasonable? That to kind of leave that barn door wide open where you can have administrative agencies say, well, this is reasonable because we need to do X, Y, and Z. And this is reasonable because we need to push the boundaries on this. That is what is really scary, is that they don't have a definition. It was basically whatever's reasonable, as long as it's not contrary to the statute or arbitrary, capricious, or anything like that. If it's reasonable and it fits in with what we believe is the intent of the statute, then the administrative agencies can get away with it. That's where we were for 40 years since Chevron.
Okay. So I interrupted you. You were about to read something else, I think?
Yeah, just a little bit more on Chevron, and then we can move on to the next cases. So this is how they reviewed it. They said, our review of the EPA's varying interpretations of the word source, both before and after the 1977 amendments, convinces us that the agency primarily responsible for administering this important legislation is consistently interpreted flexibly, not in a sterile textual vacuum, but in the context of implementing policy decisions in a technical and complex arena. An initial agency interpretation is not instantly carved in stone. And this is something that I want to highlight, because the issue is that the EPA kept going back and changing their own definition every so often. And if you're a business and you're trying to rely on what is going to happen, and all of a sudden this definition comes out, you retrofit your plants and you do whatever you have to do, and then 4 years later a new administration comes in and goes, nah, we've changed the definition of that, now you got to change it to this. That's not the continuity that I think businesses are looking for when it comes to how they want to run it. It's not profitable. And so Justice Stevens is basically in this point going, yeah, it's fine if they change their mind and they figure out something different or the times change. Like, that doesn't seem to be, forgive me, I'm trying to find the word. It's not comforting to the American citizen to know that these administrative agencies can change their mind so fluidly and it's not a big deal. And that there's really nothing we as citizens can do about it, because these are a lot of unelected bureaucrats who keep changing these definitions. We can't do anything about it. We can't vote these bureaucrats out of office. So that becomes a big sticking point for me. Then he goes on to finish, moreover, the fact that the agency has adopted different definitions in different contexts adds force to the argument that the definition itself is flexible, particularly since Congress has never indicated any disapproval of the flexible reading of the statute, which to me seems like circular argument to me, because it seems like it's okay that they keep changing the definition because they've changed the definition and it seems to be okay. That's how I read that, is that because Congress didn't step in and say anything, it's basically okay that the administrative agency keeps changing the definition because no one's stopping them. So that's fine as it is.
Also, just the perverse, like, Congress can first go ahead, they can vote for something that might, strangle business or, to have some negative repercussions. But if the agency that implements the thing right out of the gate has genuinely reasonable interpretations that aren't too cumbersome, the businesses can kind of breathe a sigh of relief and say, oh, okay, that wasn't too bad. Like, some of our worst fears when we were lobbying against this proposition or whatever weren't such a big deal. Okay. And then down the road, like you say, some new administration comes in and then new bureaucrats come in and then they are much more draconian. Well, now those Congress people aren't the ones, you know what I mean? Like, that's ancient history since they voted on that. So they're probably not going to get in trouble. And what I mean? So it's kind of it's sort of like the thing about how, geez, how come Congress doesn't declare a war anymore? And it's like, well, this way it's a lot easier if they just let the president do it. So now it's on him if it doesn't go well, but so.
Yeah. The first thing when this was struck down, someone had asked me why, I thought it was such a big deal. And I said, well, because Congress now has to do their job. Like, Congress has to show up and actually do their job and put their name on legislation and be as specific as possible. they can't just shirk all their duties and say, oh, we're just going to leave these statutes wide open and we'll just kind of shove it off to the EPA or whatever agency and let them do the work. And then if they get blowback, well, it's not us. Look, it's the EPA who did it.
Right.
Like, we didn't write those regulations.
Yeah.
So
did you see Phil? I promise I'll let you get back to your notes here, but
it
was, to me, it was the funniest reaction I saw when this ruling first came out. And I don't know, I wonder if you saw it. Like, it was so ludicrous. I thought the guy was being sarcastic and it was a joke. But going in and looking at his replies and the other people like high five, I don't think he was kidding. And if he was kidding, plenty of people didn't think he was kidding and were agreeing with him. And he said something like, "Oh, okay, so now the Supreme Court thinks that it can rule our lives instead of the experts. Thanks, guys." Just taking it as a given that somebody's going to be ruling our lives. And hey, at least before it was the experts, at the EPA and all these other places. And the FCC, right. And geez, now it's and not even getting that. No, this wasn't the Supreme Court saying we're going to be in charge of regulating stuff now. Like, anyway, but
yeah, and that's something that the dissent gets into in this case that just came out a couple weeks ago. Same exact thing, and we can talk about that when we get to that case. One last thing I wanted to end on, which I think is probably the most terrifying. This is the quote from Justice Stevens. Says, while agencies are not directly accountable to the people, the chief executive is, and it is entirely appropriate for this political branch of the government to make such policy choices, resolving the competing interests which Congress itself either inadvertently did not resolve or intentionally left to be resolved by the agency charged with the administration of the statute in light of everyday realities. To me, that's terrifying that he just goes, well, I mean, technically, the administrative agency is part of the executive branch, and we vote on a president every 4 years. So that's political in its nature. But as anyone knows, it's not easy to get rid of people in the federal administration, and it's not easy to gut a lot of these agencies. So they've kind of insulated themselves to protect themselves. If a president comes in and goes, I'm going to start just chopping up agencies left and right and getting rid of them, it's not as easy as it sounds. So if his rationale is, well, they're still beholden to the people because their boss, quote unquote, their boss, the president of the United States, is elected by the people. It's not as important as, well, congressmen are voted on every 2 years by the people. They're more accountable than these unelected bureaucrats. So to me, that was the rationale itself is terrifying, to think that, Justice Stevens goes that far to say, well, they're the experts, we'll be fine, just let them do it. It's not really in our purview. And they're technically political because we vote on the president, and the president can change it up. So that's the whole point. So that's the Chevron deference. I don't know if you had any more questions before we move on to the next thing.
Also here, let me just to go along with the point you just made. So I don't know how accurate this figure is, but I just Googled the EPA permanent workforce, how many employees, and there's over 17,000. And so, the idea, like, and some of them, have been working there for decades. And so the idea that even when Trump came in, like, I know some of the people, by the way, he actually wasn't bluffing. Like, on that one, I know he talked a big game, but he really did put in some, quote, radical, like, buddies of mine, and I have pretty radical political views at EPA and stuff like that. But it's not that all 17,000 people lost their jobs and got replaced by people that the Heritage Foundation recommended. Like, that wouldn't work. You know what I mean? Like, if they showed up, they'd be like, what, where's this file? I don't know. I just started working here too. You know what I mean? Like, you need to have some continuity, even if there's a change in the leadership. And so, the idea that, oh, well, if you don't like what the EPA is doing, just vote somebody else in as president, that's kind of goofy.
Yeah, because the president's not going to go in and just remove everybody all at once. I mean, you can certainly try and remove everybody all at once. But it's just, it's not as much of an upheaval. You don't get the direct response of, a red wave or a blue wave or whatever we switch back and forth every 2 years. You don't see that in the administrative state. You don't see that, oh, we don't like your regulations, so therefore we're just going to vote in a new president, and now that'll show you. Like, it just seems like these administrative agencies get bigger and bigger every year, no matter who's in office. And also, it doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican. We keep adding more agencies under the executive branch. So, yeah, I don't buy the whole that they're technically a political. They're a political branch of the government. I think they're just an unelected branch of the government.
Yeah, but I mean, just make sure people get the point. Like, if the shareholders don't like the performance and they can the CEO, it doesn't mean everybody working at the factory gets laid off. I mean, like, that wouldn't work. And so likewise here, and also too, the bureaucrats are smart and strategic, and so they are like showering favors on certain big companies and whatever in that industry that they're regulating, knowing, okay, when I leave, I'm going to have a cushy consulting job, but also, so some new president comes in, threatening stuff, and some of those big companies who maybe donated a ton of money to his campaign can say to him, okay, yeah, you can throw that guy on the chopping block, but, keep these other 7 guys. And, it's, again, it just showing the reality of it, that it's that opinion you read was just striking me as incredibly naive.
Yeah, and that's where we were with Chevron for 40 years, and people had talked about it for 40 years, and people had talked about striking it down, and it was people have been hoping, if you're a certain bent, a political bent, you've been hoping Chevron's is going to be struck down one day or another, because if you're not a fan of big government, this might be the blow to the administrative state that they were dreading, that probably kept them awake at night, is if Chevron deference ever gets struck down by the Supreme Court. There is an interesting case coming up. I think it was probably this week or past week, which they were now determining the statute of limitations on when you can start suing administrative agencies. So now, with this Chevron deference overturned, and they're going to determine what the statute of limitations is, there's probably going to be an absolute tsunami of companies going after a lot of these regulations that they deem, not within the new ruling of the court, which is great because, it chips away at the administrative, state little by little and weakens their power. It also makes Congress actually show up and do their job. So I think it's a win-win. It's probably the most consequential decision that has happened, probably this cycle. I mean, I know there was a lot of other big things that people were talking about, but I think Chevron was probably the biggest one.
So can you? And sorry if you're going there, but what is the new status quo? Is it just saying no, an agency can't just start making stuff up that's clearly beyond what was in the original intent, and if there's ambiguity, then you got to go back and ask for clarification from the legislature?
Yeah, I wanted to get to that, and I also wanted to get to this other case really quick. I want to touch upon it for like just a minute. And
yeah, sure, go ahead. Yeah, I didn't mean to jump the gun. I just want to make sure.
No. Yeah, I just wanted to. This was the case that I think nerds like myself who follow all this stuff, when we saw this come out, this was 2022, so 2 years ago. When we saw this decision come out, we were like, they're starting to gear up to take on Chevron. I think Chevron's next. It was EPA versus West Virginia, 6-3. I'll give you the short end of it. Basically, EPA was trying to, under Obama, transition everybody away from electricity based on coal to renewables and wind power and all that stuff. Trump came in, tried to stop it, and then it got into litigation. Long story short, Justice Roberts delivered the opinion basically saying the EPA does not have the power to determine that they are going to use, again, it's the Clean Air Act, that they were going to extend their authority under the Clean Air Act to basically decide such a consequential question of our economy as, well, no longer are we going to have electricity based on coal. We're going to have electricity based on renewables. That's a huge decision for our economy. And this court said, no, you don't get to make that decision as an administrative agency. And they use this major questions doctrine, which is basically all major questions involving the country, such as the economy, politics, national security, all that should be rested in the political branches. The truly political branches are Congress and our executive. So they struck that down, and I think that was sort of the warning sign to people that they're looking for a Chevron case, and they're ready to take on Chevron. So when this came out, I think a lot of us, people who were, again, like myself, I'm a member of the Federalist Society. We were definitely looking at that, licking our chops, going, "Ooh, Chevron, I think is next." But anyway, I'll give you the rundown of what happened in this most recent case. Again, I don't want to bore you. It involves fishermen in the EPA again. Was it the EPA? No, it was the EPA. And it involves fisheries and executive agencies. So basically, they had to pay for. I never knew this until now, that they required observers to be on fishing boats. Federal observers. They used to be paid by the government. Then they required the fishermen to start paying for them to be on the boats, which was about $710 a day. One company, it equaled out to be like 20% loss on their overall revenue to keep paying these guys to be on their boats. There was nothing that said that they could do any of this. Again, this case got up to the Supreme Court. It involved fishermen and guys sitting on boats.
What were they observing? Do you even know?
They were basically making sure that places that they weren't overfishing, they were in the right area, they weren't overfishing certain environments, stuff like that. So it was like foreign boats in their waters. They had declared 200 nautical miles around the United States, basically, as their exclusive jurisdiction to say, like, yeah, we have exclusive jurisdiction to monitor and make sure that you're not overfishing these areas. And to make sure you're not overfishing, we're going to put all these federal observers on your boats. And if we can't pay for it, you're going to pay for it. And if you don't pay for it, then we're going to sanction you and fine you. So anyway, this was, I guess, the closest they could get to this Chevron deference, because this was, again, a similar situation where EPA kind of just went ahead and said, we're going to just go ahead and not really, this wasn't Congress's intent, but we're going to make this a new rule and regulation. Justice Roberts delivered the opinion of the court and said that Chevron has always been sort of wrong for 40 years. It's been wrong since it was inceptualized, and we've kind of been doing this patchwork of making Chevron work. But in reality, it comes down to the Administrative Policies Act, which was enacted after the New Deal. Because after if you're a fan of history, you know that during the New Deal, we had an enormous expansion of government. All these administrative agencies under FDR were created. And so the APA was created as a way to kind of place a check and balance on the administrative state, which basically says that the courts are to decide legal questions by applying their own judgment, and therefore makes clear that agency interpretation of statutes, like agency interpretations of the Constitution, are not entitled to deference. Under the APA, Roberts concludes, it thus remains the responsibility of the court to decide whether the law means what the agency says. So,
Hey, Phil, just to make sure people don't get confused, there you were saying APA, right? Not EPA?
AP,
And
APA, yeah.
What does that stand for again?
Administrative Procedures Act.
Okay.
So this has been in effect since the 40s, and long and short of it, he's saying that this has been in effect since the 40s. We've already had a way to determine how to review administrative policies since long before Chevron. And just because Chevron came along, that doesn't mean all of a sudden the court loses its jurisdiction or its ability to review laws. The Constitution is very clear. If there are laws that are ambiguous that have been written by Congress, it is the role of the courts, the judicial branch, to review those laws and determine whether they are ambiguous or not. And to your point, you were saying before, people are afraid, oh, well, now the court is going to figure out, well, what does this mean? And what does that mean? That's what we have scientists for. But the argument really is the Supreme Court is, I would argue, the experts on law in America. And if there is an issue with laws in America, well, there's only one expert you go to. That's the Supreme Court. So that's what it comes down to, is whether a law is constructed properly or it's constitutional, not whether, this certain indigenous bird or something. That's not what they're really talking about in terms of the experts. They're talking about whether there's ambiguity in the laws and whether it can be enforced.
Hey, folks, let's take a break from the action to talk about today's sponsor, who is Monetary Metals. Now, Monetary Metals is providing a true alternative to saving and earning in dollars by making it possible to save and earn in gold and silver. Monetary Metals has been paying interest on gold and silver for over 8 years. Right now, accredited investors can earn 12% annual interest on silver paid in silver in their latest silver bond offering. For example, if you have 1,000 ounces of silver in the deal, you receive 120 ounces of silver interest paid to your account in the first year. So go to the link in the description of this show or head to monetary-metals.com/Murphy to learn more about how to participate and start earning a return on honest money again with Monetary Metals. Again, go to the link that's in the description of this particular episode or just go to monetary-metals.com/Murphy to see how you can get on board. Right. It's not that if the EPA wants to get rid of coal-fired power plants, the Supreme Court's going to say, no, why don't you just put in place a $60 per ton carbon tax? Like, that's not what's going on.
No,
The Supreme Court's just going to say, no, you can't do that. If you want to do that, go tell Congress to give you the authority to do that.
No, they're going back to the APA, which has been around for way longer than Chevron deference, which is if there is this ambiguity and Congress didn't write what they wanted into these laws, the administrative agencies don't get to just go in there and figure out what they want to put in there. So they're kind of ironically projecting what they think, which is, well, we don't want the Supreme Court to put their own emphasis on what the law means.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's
we do
job.
want this. That's the administrative agency's job, right? Like that's what we should leave that power to them. There was because Justice Thomas, I'm going to pull up this highlight because I think Justice Thomas, if you don't know about sort of the politics of what's happened with the court, after Scalia passed away, he's kind of stepped into the Scalia role. If your listeners aren't familiar, it's Justice Antonin Scalia, probably one of the most brilliant legal minds to ever sit on the Supreme Court, in my opinion. Probably one of the best writers as well on the Supreme Court. After he passed away, Justice Thomas kind of stepped into that role of Scalia to kind of honor his friend. He used to never talk at a lot of these oral arguments. Justice Thomas would never say anything. And after Scalia passed away, the first oral argument, he actually said something, and everyone was like, whoa, Justice Thomas said something. And he's been a little bit more aggressive since then. But ever since then, I love. Can you
speculate? Is it just because before he was deferred, like, oh no, Scalia's got it, but then now it's like, well, it's up to me.
Yeah, I think that probably was probably it. Like Scalia was such a bigger than life personality. I think Thomas probably just said, Scalia's got it. He's the big voice. I agree with everything that he usually says. I concur with a lot what he says. But you've seen him a lot more writing concurrences with majority opinions. He's written a lot. He's written some of the opinions on the Second Amendment. A lot of Second Amendment legislation he's written, which is great reads. If you're a big history buff and you want to read about the history, go read Justice Thomas, a lot of his opinions. But he wrote a concurrence to this, which I think is the bigger and most important question that we can probably sum all this up on. And he writes, I write separately to underscore a more fundamental problem. Chevron deference also violates our Constitution's separation of powers, as I've previously explained at length. To provide practical and real protections for individual liberty, the framers drafted a constitution that divides the legislative, executive, and judicial powers between three branches of government. Chevron deference compromises this separation of powers in two ways. It curbs the judicial power afforded to courts and simultaneously expands agencies' executive power beyond constitutional limits. By tying a judge's hands, Chevron prevents the judiciary from serving as a constitutional check on the executive. It allows the executive to dictate the outcome of cases through erroneous interpretation. Chevron deference also permits the executive branch to exercise powers not given to it. Quote, when the government is called upon to perform a function that requires an exercise of legislative, executive, or judicial power, only the vested recipient of that power can perform it. So that was it. It's a very short, it's only like 5 pages, his concurrence, but I think it's very powerful, the fact that he wrote that. Because I think that's the biggest sort of lesson to take away from Chevron is the idea of separation of powers and how much was being delegated to these agencies to kind of effectively write laws by people who we did not elect. That the Constitution was very clear how this is supposed to work, and administrative agencies were not a calculus of who was going to write laws.
Yeah, I mean, there's an analogous, so I'm an economist, there's an analogous argument about monetary policy where, you know, right now, the Fed gets created and they, you know, they're the experts and they can go ahead and do it. And it's a quasi-private entity. Like, there's literally banks own the Fed. It's a weird, you know, where it's not like pharmaceutical companies literally own the FDA, even though they certainly influence behind the scenes, I imagine. And Joe Salerno, who's an Austrian economist, I don't know if this is like literally his opinion, but he has certainly entertained the idea that even though it's scary to give the printing press to Congress, like, I don't want Nancy Pelosi making monetary policy decisions, but at least then the people would know who to blame for inflation, and, you know, the buck literally would stop with them, and then you could vote them out and that sort of thing. Whereas if it's the Fed, it kind of seems like, well, it's not our fault. I mean, it's the independent monetary authority. They're the experts, so, you know, so there is that element that whether you like what they do or not, that's Congress, like you say, Congress's job, and all the authorization to do all this stuff is ultimately coming from them. So it's this weird thing where they can like let the genie out of the bottle and then step back and say, "Oh, it's not our fault. We're not the EPA. We're not the Fed."
Yeah, and I think that was something I was thinking about while reading all this. Is at the core of it, you have to kind of wonder, well, if congressmen and women, are not smart enough to be writing these laws that affect these aspects of our lives, it kind of raises the question, should Congress be writing these laws?
Right,
and it's kind of like, should they be that involved in everyday life, in our economy, in our healthcare, in all of this stuff? If they're not experts in it and we're electing them to write these laws and they just keep passing the buck, maybe they shouldn't be passing these laws. And it kind of brings into scope of like, how big should the government be in terms of that? And that's something that I think people need to take away from this, is that they've created this big kind of disgusting monster in the administrative state, and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. It sucks up hundreds of billions of dollars every single year, does whatever it wants. It had no recourse. And this is a gut punch. You know, this is almost a knockout blow for the administrative state, because it's really going to put them on their back for years to come. So
having said that, I mean, I do have to say, I guess with, I don't know if sympathy is the right word, but for a long time when leftists would complain about the Supreme Court and say stuff like, they're going to take away Roe v. Wade, I was like, oh, no, they're not. No one's ever going to do it. And then they did. And then this. So it's like, oh, maybe the progressive left freaking out about the Supreme Court, maybe they actually weren't Chicken Little. Like, from their point of view, this really is unbelievably horrible.
Right. And I think, well, they're going to fearmonger one way or another, because they're saying that this is the Supreme Court trying to come in and they want to have a say on everything. And I pulled up this quote. This is from Justice Kagan, who dissented. She goes to say, its justification comes down in the end to this: courts must have more say over regulation, over the provision of healthcare, the protection of the environment, the safety in consumer products, the efficacy of transportation systems, and so on. The majority disdains restraint and grasps for power. Which is not, if you've read actually any of these opinions, and I doubt many of these people screeching have read any of these opinions, most of these opinions always come back to the same conclusion with this court. everything comes back to the people and the ability to be responsible and responsive to the people who vote you into power. And the fact that the left screeches about how the Supreme Court is taking away this right and that right, like with Roe v. Wade, everyone's saying, oh, they took away this right. They took it. Well, states now have the ability to figure out what they want to do. I live here in California. It has no effect on us whatsoever. We, in fact, California passed Prop 1, which basically legalizes all abortion. And it gives power back to the states and to the people. And every sort of decision that they've come out with, that the progressives screech about, if you actually read it, it actually always goes back to, we're giving power back to you, the voters. We're cutting back on the government. We're giving the power back to you as the Constitution intended.
Yeah,
so
they're big on democracy unless people vote the wrong way. Like the people in California can vote on abortion because they know what they're doing, but not the people in Alabama. You can't trust them.
No. We don't want people in Alabama voting on abortion because, God forbid, they disagree with us. So, yeah, it's always the shrieking and the gaslighting. But if you actually sat down and read these opinions, a lot of it, I bet if you kind of took this all away and do one of those like man on the street interviews and just took the core of it and really kind of simplified it and asked people, I bet most people would probably be like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And be like, well, do you know the Supreme Court just passed that? They'd be like, what? So, yeah. And that's where we're at now with Chevron is it's giving power back to the people that, if you don't like something and you want to have a recourse, guess what? You get to vote on a new congressperson every 2 years. So that's your recourse. That's your voice in the government. So,
and I suppose that might be another reason that the whether it's Trump or whoever the Democrats, whether it's Biden or somebody else, put up, that could also be important because presumably now if a bunch of this stuff is getting struck down, then if there was a left administration that was all about intervention, then maybe they would, sign into law like more specific codification of what the EPA had been wanting to do and say, okay, yeah, so now here Congress authorizes it, but if it's Trump in office, then he might not, sign that stuff.
Yeah, well, it comes down to the old Obama saying, which is I've got a pen and a phone. And it's basically he didn't need Congress to do anything because with Chevron deference and the amount of administrative agencies he had at his helm, at his fingertips, he didn't need Congress to do a lot of things. He could just do executive orders and change a lot of things and change rules and regulations and direct people to do what he wanted with these agencies. Obama he was a very smart politician, obviously an attorney himself. He also went to law school, so he knew what was going on with Chevron deference. But yeah, it comes down to you've weakened the power of the president to kind of lean on agencies, administrative agencies, to enact their policies, because if it's not written down by Congress, you can't really get away with it anymore. So, yeah, I think if you're a president who wants to wield the power of these agencies without Congress, without anybody that's elected, you might not like this decision. So,
I mean, I totally get what you're saying there, and I agree with that. But I'm making a slightly different point, though. I'm saying, given now that this, Chevron is out, that if Biden gets reelected or whoever it is, then conceivably they could, the Congress could go ahead and pass for more specific rules, like giving the EPA specific powers to do X, Y, and Z that before was just like bundled up under Chevron deference, and then Biden would go ahead and sign that. So I'm saying if stuff is up in the air now and EPA can't do that. If Trump's in there, then it's probably like another 4 years where businesses can, do things that are profitable, at least for another 4 years, as opposed
to. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, because obviously, under Trump, I don't think that there would be a huge expansion of the EPA under him. But again, it comes back to they have to be specific, and you have the ability to. Your recourse is they're your elected officials, and once word gets out of what's in these legislation or in these bills, that's the recourse. You know what's in the bills. You can call your congressman, you can call your representative and say, no, you're not passing this. And then they kind of have to go face the fire in a sense. They have to kind of stand by it. So if it's super specific as to what they want to do, you kind of got to have to stand by it now. You have that power. You can be as as descriptive as you want under this because Chevron deference is gone. But also now you have to actually stand by something. And that most politicians probably don't want to stand by something that's uber radical or something, right? Because they want to stay in office as long as possible.
Okay, well, great, Phil. This is exactly what I was hoping to get from you as we look at the clock here. Maybe in closing, you just want to make a case for why people, if they like this, should tune into your podcast.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Bob. California Underground Podcast. We focus a lot on California politics, specifically state politics. We try to be a opposing voice in a deep sea of blue out here. So we talk about a lot of this stuff, Supreme Court rulings. We talk about what happens. We talked about the California Supreme Court rulings, but we also have a lot of people on as well, people who are running for state legislature. We had gubernatorial candidates on. We just had a congressional candidate on. It's basically the voice for the people who feel like they have no voice in California. So if you're that type of person, want to check it out, California Underground Podcast, Spotify, Apple, Google, YouTube, Rumble, all that stuff. So,
okay, great. So, folks, my guest has been Phil Mauriello of the California Underground Podcast, an attorney based in California, member of the Federalist Society, and defender of individual liberties. So, thanks, Phil, for your time and your insights.
Thanks a lot for having me, Bob.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.